See, like, I know what joke I want to do for the opening of this because I can't hear the name Hilda without thinking of that one part of Eddie Izzard's bit. I think it was from Dressed to Kill where Dr. Heimlich is waking up his wife Hilda. Oh, Hilda, wake up! And I've now explained the joke, and so if anybody was going to get it, I've really blown it. What is it, Dr. Heimlich, you big waking up person? Okay, yeah, I should have just gone with that. Heck with it. All right, Hilda, the animated show on Netflix. I've had more than a few people recommend it to me, especially after I covered She-Ra. And I have now seen the entirety of the season. I don't know if it's intended to be a multi-season show. It certainly could be. There's nothing about it that would preclude it from doing that. I just don't know if the intention is for a second season or if they've announced. So I'm just gonna, I'll call it season 1. So there is a lot about this that I am inherently going to enjoy. So there is kind of that fairy tale logic that I've talked about before, which is something that I really appreciate from things like Pan's Labyrinth, the original Labyrinth, you know, a lot of sort of animated things aimed for kids sort of have the logic of fairy tales, which is not your normal logic. Like, oh, well, you know, if you do this around this creature, then this happens. Why? Who cares? That's just what happens. And I always like that approach. The animation style is really nice. I especially like how smoothly everything moves. I, personally speaking, I am always willing to sacrifice highly detailed art for the sake of smoother movement. So, like, if I can only have one, I will always take something like this over what's been going on with a lot of the DC animated stuff lately, where the characters are pretty highly detailed, but they move jerky and there's fewer frames of animation. Or, you know, they kind of did that with the Dragon Prince too. I will always prefer a simplified animation style that moves smoothly. So that's really nice. And I kind of like that they play off the animation style a little bit at a few points, with some characters flat out saying, I've got a stick for a hand, because from a drawing perspective, they do. So that's kind of cool and fun. I like the mystical and the magical elements. They're inventive, they're unique, but they feel pretty organic to this world. Hilda herself is a good, solid protagonist for a world like this. She is adventurous, she's kind-hearted, she's always meaning, you know, trying to do the right thing, but she's also you know, sort of very self-assured to the point that it kind of gets her in trouble. She's always sure that she can solve the situation, even though sometimes she either can't or she should be getting help doing it. So with all of this in place, why didn't I like it more? Now, I want to be clear, I don't dislike it. I did enjoy it, but I didn't burn through it. It took me like 4 or 5 sittings to get through this. It just didn't grab me on the level that, looking at the component parts, I would have expected it to. So I've kind of been having a think on, you know, what is it about this that isn't quite working for me? I think initially what I definitely noticed, it took me like 3 or 4 episodes to feel like I was starting to connect with it at all, beyond just sort of finding the visuals pleasant. And I think a big part of that delayed engagement, and then sort of that kind of kneecapped the whole thing, where, you know, by the end, I think I was pretty much on board by the end, but I would have expected to be much sooner. I think a big part of it is when you are dealing with a world this weird, at least, and this is speaking personally, I'm not saying that this is a requirement for anyone doing this kind of story, but for me, I need to get centered. I need to know what passes for normal, so that I can know how I'm meant to be reacting to various things. So when you have, you know, a character who is encountering things like trolls, and she's got a deer fox. Twig is adorable. I do love Twig. And, you know, so obviously this is not just, you know, a world in which nobody sees this stuff. So she sees this stuff, she encounters this stuff. You know, we get the Woodman in the first episode who her mother, you know, it doesn't find weird at all. Okay, so it's not just her. But at the same time, there's a vibe early on in how isolated they are. Like, okay, is her and her mother unique? Would other people elsewhere know about this? Something she's reacting to, she's like, oh my gosh, what's that? I'm like, okay, well, what's the standard base level knowledge of what magical things you do and don't know about? And it took me about 3 or 4 episodes to get myself orientated for what passed for normal, because she would have reactions to things and I'd be like, well, okay, are you surprised? Is this just, oh, I didn't expect to see this, or I didn't know this was possible? Like, I couldn't gauge. So if I were to make a comparison to another animated show that I, miniseries in this case, that I love, and it's got a similar general feel, but like a very different tone, and that's Over the Garden Wall. Now, Over the Garden Wall is a very weird miniseries that does a lot of weird things. But pretty much immediately, the main characters, the 2 brothers, are lost, meaning, okay, they're not supposed to be here, and the older brother is acting as if all this stuff is very strange. Okay, to them, this is not normal, and the younger brother is rolling with it, but you get a sense of his personality that that's just how he is. It's not that he knows about this stuff, it's just that he isn't bothered by it. So immediately, I have a gauge for my lead characters as to how out of place or in place they are in the world we're in. And that's established like immediately in that show. And I was just lacking that grounding at the front end of it. Now, as I said, 3 or 4 episodes in, it started to click a bit better, but that meant that usually 3rd or 4th episode is when I fall in love with a show that I'm enjoying. Here, it took 3 or 4 episodes for me to get to the point that I feel like I should have been at episode 1, and so it wasn't until like episode 7 or 8 that I started to really enjoy the show, and that's late in the run of a 13-episode show. And again, this is just me and how I digest these kinds of things. I don't want it to seem like I'm calling these outright flaws of the show, because I can see reactions and see very clearly a lot of people like leapt into this and embraced it from the get-go. That's phenomenal. All I can do is explain why it was a little bit of a harder sell for me. I do like a lot of the creatures. I like that a heck of a lot of the mysticism or whatever feels very similar to stuff that I know, but a little bit different. So like we start with some more basic stuff, trolls, elves. Oh, okay, they're setting their own rules for that. But then we get into things, well, we get into things like the Woodman, who's kind of a jerk. That was an odd thing to have sink in over time. But you know, him, the way the giants work, the weather spirits, the house spirits that we're dealing with towards the end, the tide mice, you know, things like this that feel like they fit the world that was established early on, but also are unique. And I'm like, ooh, what's that about? And they feel very true to, you know, folklore and myths and fairy tales. And it's distinctly possible that these things were pulled from, you know, bits of folklore that I'm just not familiar with. That's possible, but it was kind of cool to feel like I was getting new folklore, because I like that. The supporting cast, the mother was fine. The mother was another character that I felt like I wasn't sure what the show wanted me to think of her. Like, I got that she was a good person, and that's fine, but like there are sometimes she's pushing Hilda, sometimes she's grounding Hilda, and I'm not saying that the relationship doesn't work. It feels very genuine, but there were weird moments, like how adamantly against housing was it the Missa? Is that what they were called? The little house spirit that Hilda wanted to sort of take in. And her mother was so adamantly against that it felt out of character because it lacked a firm explanation of why. Because she seemed to roll with most of this mystical stuff. So it's not a case of, I don't want this stuff in my house. And then but then they didn't explain why she had such an issue with these kinds of spirits. And again, it's just a weird disconnect that it wasn't addressed. I like her friends that we meet. I kind of like that early on when she first ends up in town. that we get Trevor introduced, and I'm like, oh, I don't like this kid, but you know, this is going to be the antagonistic thing that becomes a friendship, and it wasn't. He was just a jerk, and we're done with him. Cool, awesome. I think that's kind of another thing, though, I think it's another reason I had a hard time grasping onto this was I had a hard time understanding the progression episode to episode, because this show, if you were to ask me, is it serialized or episodic, I kind of got a shrug, because like sometimes it tells stories that are completely and utterly self-contained, and other times it feels like it's building to a greater whole, but then it wraps up and cuts off and the next episode starts with something completely fresh. It kind of just seems to jerk around in terms of like, oh, well, that finished the story. Oh, but wait, we're gonna end with a cliffhanger for the following episode. Like, oh, but it doesn't feel like it's part of a grander story in the way that, again, something like, say, Over the Garden Wall was, where, you know, we know the quest, we know the mission. They're lost, they need to find their way home. So whatever complications they run into, that's still the grander story. Here, it's just much more incidental. So, like, when their house got destroyed in, I think, the second episode, and it's like, well, we're going to have to move into town. I'm like, oh, it's going to be adapting to a new environment story. But then she gets there, and the first sort of kid she runs into, she doesn't get along with. But then she makes friends pretty much right away by episode 4. And she's a little bit, you know, I wish that I was still in the woods, but that doesn't feel like much of a theme across the, maybe that's the thing. And maybe I missed it, but I couldn't wrap my head around a thematic through line. And it's structured in such a way that makes me feel like there either is supposed to be one there or there is one there and I missed it. Because there isn't really a narrative through line, yet it does still feel like they're doing all this stuff that feels like connective tissue, but it's not narratively. So I'm thinking, well, it must be thematic connective tissue, but again, like, maybe I just missed it. Maybe I have to assume there's something here I'm missing. There's something I'm not getting. And again, for all the like sort of over dissection I'm doing of my issues with it, it's still good and I would recommend it. It's fun, it's light, the characters are enjoyable. Like I said, I really like the art style and I love the imagination on display. I'm gonna see if my daughter enjoys it at all, because I think it's the kind of thing she would like. But for me, it felt ever so slightly off for reasons that I'm just having a hard time pinning down. All right, quick addendum to Hilda, because I have now actually started watching it with my daughter, and she is enjoying it quite a bit, which I suspected she would. It was a pretty easy sell pretty much as soon as I told her about Twig, and I said, there's a creature in it called a deer fox, and it's a little white fox with antlers, and she was like, I want to see that. So I know my kid pretty well. So she's digging the heck out of it, and I have to say I am enjoying it much more on a rewatch, which isn't all that shocking given my issues sort of with like finding my footing with the thing, because on a rewatch I've already done that, so I'm able to appreciate these early episodes more and better. I'm not gonna the reason I'm adding this as an addendum instead of re-recording all of the entire review is because I still think my feelings, I stand by them, because I'm always hesitant to say it's good on a rewatch, because that's kind of a big commitment to ask of people, especially on like a show as opposed to a movie that you have to watch it twice to get the full appreciation. But some things are like that, and actually when I told Liz that I was having a much better experience with it the second time because I understood it better, she was like, oh, so it's like the Big Lebowski of animated Netflix shows. And I was like, you know, for how divergent the content is, that's not a terrible comparison. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. And that's my little addition. So that's my thoughts on Hilda. You seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. A whole bunch of stuff you can do, such as click the buttons or the links. There's a link to my Patreon, you know, if you want to support me that way. If not, though, don't sweat it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do down there. You don't want to click on any of it? That's fine, too, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.